Settle in now, and let us turn our attention to one of the most tumultuous and complex decades in modern history, a period of immense upheaval known as the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution in the People's Republic of China. This is a chronicle steeped in ideology, ambition, and the profound, often tragic, energy of mass mobilization. The pages we turn are heavy, not just with age, but with the weight of political ambition and human suffering. Take a deep, slow breath. The atmosphere we enter is one of paranoia, of fear, and of revolutionary fervor directed against the very structures of power it was intended to serve. Our journey begins not in the streets, but in the inner chambers of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, specifically with the towering figure of Mao Zedong, the chairman. The year is 1966, but the roots of this revolution stretch back to the quiet, acknowledged failures of the recent past. Recall the catastrophic years of the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1962, a massive, utopian effort at rapid industrialization and collectivization that resulted, instead, in widespread famine and the deaths of tens of millions. The failure of this grand design had forced Mao to step back from the daily management of the state, allowing more pragmatic, moderate leaders to assume control. Figures such as Liu Shaoqi, the president of the PRC, and Deng Xiaoping, the party's general secretary. These leaders, whom we might refer to as the pragmatists or, in the charged language of the time, capitalist roaders, sought stability and economic recovery. They quietly dismantled some of the radical collective structures and introduced market-oriented incentives to revive agriculture and industry, a necessary but ideologically dangerous deviation from Mao's pure revolutionary path. Mao, observing this shift from the sidelines, grew increasingly alarmed. He viewed these policies not as necessary corrections to an economic disaster, but as a profound betrayal of the pure revolutionary ideal, a slow drift back toward a form of disguised capitalism, what was called revisionism, the same path he believed the Soviet Union had taken after the death of Stalin. He saw a new, soft bourgeoisie taking root within the party bureaucracy itself, threatening to undermine his life's work. His greatest fear was that the revolutionary zeal of the party had been extinguished, replaced by a rigid, bureaucratic, and privileged elite. He believed that the only way to save the revolution, to prevent what he called the restoration of capitalism, was to unleash the masses, to engage in a continuous, violent struggle against this new internal enemy. This process, he theorized, required not just purges, but a permanent revolution from the ground up. The initial weapons of this revolution were not yet guns, but carefully crafted words and cultural attacks designed to prepare the ideological battlefield. The movement began quietly in the cultural sphere in late 1965, targeting a popular historical drama, Hai Rui Dismissed from Office, written by the deputy mayor of Beijing, Wu Han. The play was reinterpreted by radical Maoists as a coded criticism of Mao's own dismissal of a prominent official years earlier. This purging of the cultural scene was the necessary prelude to the political earthquake that was to follow. Then came the formal, thunderous launch of the revolution in May 1966, a declaration of intent that fundamentally challenged the established authority. The May 16th circular, followed by the publication of Mao's own blistering "Bombard the headquarters" poster in August, was the formal call to arms. Mao urged the masses to dare to rebel and to overthrow the persons in authority who are taking the capitalist road. This was a genius, yet terrifying, political maneuver. Instead of purging the party from the top down using traditional methods, Mao mobilized the outside, the students, the laborers, the disenfranchised, to attack the party from the bottom up. He essentially called for a civil war within the party structure itself, bypassing the apparatus that was supposed to be loyal to him but which he now utterly distrusted. The response was immediate, overwhelming, and terrifying in its absolute dedication. Millions of young students, often from poor peasant or worker backgrounds, who had been raised on the cult of Mao and were hungry for meaning and power, rose up with frenetic energy. They were organized into spontaneous, decentralized units called the Red Guards. Imagine the scenes in the great squares of Beijing and Shanghai. Huge, swirling masses of passionate youth, often wearing army surplus jackets and crimson armbands, holding aloft the iconic little red book quotations from Chairman Mao Tse Tung. The air was thick with the frenetic energy of absolute certainty and righteous indignation. This book, containing Mao's distilled ideological wisdom, became the new, portable Bible of the nation, its phrases recited and chanted everywhere as the supreme authority, overruling all previous laws and customs. The Red Guards were granted an almost terrifying, absolute license to act. They were told that any action taken in the name of Mao and the revolution was justified. They were instructed to distinguish themselves by being fierce, fast, and resolute. Their first targets were the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. This was the official, systematic campaign to tear down the remnants of China's immense, complex history and tradition, which Mao viewed as the ideological foundation for the capitalist roaders. The resulting cultural devastation was immense and immediate. Libraries were ransacked, priceless books were burned in massive, choking pyres that blanketed urban areas with the acrid smell of burning paper. Temples, centuries-old shrines, and ancestral halls were desecrated, vandalized, and ultimately destroyed. Artworks, ancient calligraphy, sculptures, and historical relics, the irreplaceable physical evidence of millennia of Chinese civilization, were smashed, dissolved, or simply buried in haste. Imagine the quiet, deep crash of porcelain against stone, the low, powerful thud of a gilded Buddhist statue being toppled, the slow, dry sizzle of burning silk banners. These were the continuous, heartbreaking sounds of history being systematically erased by the zealous hands of its own children. The country was experiencing a deliberate, self-inflicted lobotomy on its cultural memory, all in the name of creating a new, purely revolutionary future. But the violence quickly moved from inanimate objects to defenseless people. The Red Guards turned their fury on perceived enemies of the revolution: intellectuals, teachers, writers, artists, and anyone with a perceived bad class background, such as former landlords or merchants. They were dragged into massive public spectacles known as struggle sessions. Picture the chilling scene of a struggle session. The vast crowd, the blinding glare of a weak spotlight at night illuminating the terror. The victim, perhaps an elderly university professor, perhaps a former merchant, perhaps a high-ranking party official, is forced onto a stage, head bowed low, often wearing a crudely fashioned dunce cap or a heavy wooden sign proclaiming their crimes. The dominant sound is a low, continuous roar of accusation, denunciation, and humiliation, a wave of collective, directed rage that washes away individual reason. They were physically beaten, verbally denounced, and forced to confess to imaginary or vastly exaggerated crimes against the revolution. This intense, focused humiliation was designed not just to punish the individual victim, but to terrorize the onlookers into absolute conformity and complicity. The line between victim and perpetrator was thin and constantly shifting, and everyone learned quickly that silence and preemptive denunciation were the only keys to a temporary survival. The entire established political system was paralyzed. Top party leaders, once considered untouchable, were now openly targeted. Liu Shaoqi was denounced as the China's Khrushchev and the #1 capitalist roader. He was purged, imprisoned, denied essential medical treatment, and eventually died in isolation. A profound and shocking end for the party's second most powerful man, marking the complete overthrow of the established order. Deng Xiaoping was also purged, humiliated, and sent to work in a tractor repair factory in the countryside. The entire established party structure was utterly shattered by the mass mobilization. The sheer anarchy of the Red Guards, however, soon became a serious problem for Mao himself. The movement was so successful at destroying the old authority that it fractured into rival, armed factions fighting each other for the right to be called the truest revolutionary. Cities descended into chaos, industry stalled, factories shut down, and the entire national infrastructure began to wobble dangerously near total collapse. The revolution had achieved its goal of smashing the old system, but the destructive chaos that followed was politically unproductive and threatened to undermine the very state it was supposed to purify. By 1968, the violence was so random and widespread that the only force capable of restoring order was the People's Liberation Army PLA, led by Defense Minister Lin Biao, who had consistently been Mao's most loyal and powerful supporter throughout the initial, anarchic stages of the Cultural Revolution. The period of mass mobilization was drawing to its chaotic, violent close. We move now into the second, less spontaneously chaotic, but equally ruthless phase of the Cultural Revolution. The period where the People's Liberation Army PLA was decisively brought into established control and the revolution began its dark process of turning inward, consuming its own initial supporters. By 1968, the anarchy generated by the Red Guards was deemed politically and economically unsustainable by the central leadership. The Red Guards, having served their destructive purpose of shattering the old party hierarchy and discrediting Mao's rivals, now had to be disciplined and removed from the urban centers they were paralyzing. Mao issued a series of quiet directives that signaled the end of the Red Guard phase. The most profound and impactful of these was the launch of the massive Down to the Countryside movement, or Shangshan Xiaxiang, meaning up to the mountains, down to the villages. Millions of urban, educated youth, the very former Red Guards who had led the charge, were forcibly sent away from the cities to live in remote rural villages, supposedly to be re-educated by the peasant masses. Imagine the massive, slow, quiet exodus. Trains and trucks loaded with bewildered, newly displaced teenagers carrying small, heavy satchels, leaving the urban centers where they had once held absolute revolutionary power, now facing the harsh, unfamiliar realities of arduous manual labor and primitive living conditions. This movement, designed to disperse the volatile youth and instill proletarian consciousness, simultaneously served to exile an entire generation. It created the lost generation, a generation whose formal education, career prospects, and lives were severely interrupted for years, adding a layer of personal tragedy to the great political upheaval. As the Red Guards were officially dissolved, the PLA, under the consolidated command of Lin Biao, took on an immense, dominant political role. The military became the most powerful force in the provinces, governing vast regions and establishing new, local organs of power called revolutionary committees that replaced the shattered civilian government. Lin Biao, whose unwavering loyalty had been crucial to Mao, was formally declared Mao's closest comrade in arms and successor in the 1969 party constitution. The cult of Mao, promoted fiercely by Lin Biao through the distribution and recitation of the Little Red Book, was at its absolute, all-consuming peak. However, the immense political and military power consolidated by the PLA and its leader, Lin Biao, quickly created a new source of tension at the very top. Mao was an undisputed master of political maneuvering. He rarely allowed any single individual or faction to become too powerful for too long, always maintaining his own position as the ultimate, indispensable revolutionary authority. He began to perceive Lin Biao, now wielding the power of the military and holding the position of successor, as a distinct, immediate threat to his own ultimate, unchallenged authority. The relationship between the two most powerful men in China rapidly deteriorated in the years 1970 and 1971. The disagreements were complex, touching upon the role of the military in the government. The direction of evolving foreign policy, particularly the secret overtures to the United States and the contentious wording of the state constitution. Mao quietly maneuvered to reduce the influence of Lin Biao's key military allies and dismantle the power base he had allowed Lin to construct. This intense, internal political struggle culminated in the bizarre, shocking, and tragic event of September 1971, Lin Biao's downfall. According to the official narrative, which was presented to the stunned Chinese public many months later, Lin Biao, fearing an imminent purge and loss of power, attempted a military coup against Mao Zedong, known by the code name Project 571, a phonetic pun in Chinese meaning armed uprising. When the coup allegedly failed, Lin Biao and his immediate family boarded a plane, reportedly attempting to flee the country to seek asylum in the Soviet Union. Imagine the quiet, intense drama of that night. The sound of a large, heavy jet taking off in the middle of the dark, silent night, carrying the second most powerful man in China, pursued by the very security apparatus he had helped consolidate. The plane crashed in the remote, desolate regions of Mongolia under mysterious circumstances, killing all on board. The news of Lin Biao's death and his supposed treachery that he was a bourgeois careerist and traitor who had attempted to assassinate the chairman sent a profound shockwave through the entire nation. The man who had been the most visible, ardent, and officially designated supporter of the Cultural Revolution, the official successor, was suddenly exposed as the ultimate villain. The revelation created a massive, profound ideological crisis for the faithful. If Lin Biao, the model of revolutionary devotion, could be a traitor who then could truly be trusted, the entire official narrative of the past 5 years was thrown into silent, internal doubt. The spectacular purge of Lin Biao and his military allies marked a decisive turning point in the revolution. It exposed the deep-seated political instability and ruthless maneuvering at the very top of the CCP leadership. The entire episode led to a wave of quiet distrust and forced the public to question the official narrative, albeit silently and internally. The sheer scale of the chaos and the collapse of the established leadership structure forced a gradual, cautious effort toward national stabilization. The long, difficult process of national recovery, evaluation, and reckoning began immediately. The immediate impact of the Cultural Revolution was staggering and terrible. Human cost and persecution. The estimates of those who died as a direct result of the violence, purges, and subsequent famine range widely from hundreds of thousands to over 2 million. Millions more intellectuals, former officials, teachers, and ordinary citizens were subjected to torture, imprisonment, public humiliation, and internal exile. The psychological scars left by neighbor turning on neighbor, student on teacher, and child denouncing parent were immense and deep, damaging the core social trust of the society. Cultural and intellectual destruction. The loss of cultural heritage, the ancient texts, temples, historical sites, and artifacts was catastrophic and remains an irreparable loss to human civilization. The intellectual class was decimated, robbing the country of a generation of potential doctors, scientists, and educators. Economic and educational disruption. The constant political turmoil and the systematic closing of schools and universities led to widespread economic stagnation and created the lost generation of uneducated urban youth who had been sent to the countryside. The final, official word on the entire Cultural Revolution came in 1981, after Deng Xiaoping had successfully returned to power and began his monumental program of economic reforms. The CCP issued the landmark document, Resolution on Certain Questions in the History of Our Party Since the Founding of the People's Republic of China. This crucial document officially and unequivocally condemned the Cultural Revolution as a severe setback and loss for the party and the country, declaring it entirely responsible for the decade of misery. It assigned the primary responsibility for the mistakes of the revolution to Mao Zedong's erroneous leadership in his later years. while crucially maintaining his overall historical position as the necessary, heroic founder of the nation and the architect of the successful communist revolution. The official, measured verdict was famously summarized as, Mao was 70% right and 30% wrong. This careful, complex, and politically necessary judgment was required to allow the party to move forward and reform without completely destroying its own historical foundation and source of legitimacy. Deng Xiaoping's subsequent, profound reforms, the opening up of the economy, the strategic shift to a market socialist model, were a definitive, quiet rejection of the Cultural Revolution's core ideological tenets. The national focus shifted entirely and overwhelmingly from continuous, destructive class struggle to overwhelming, pragmatic economic construction. The legacy of the Cultural Revolution remains immense and subtle. It instilled a deep-seated national fear of political chaos and violence and created a profound, quiet societal desire for stability and rapid economic improvement above all else. It remains a historical period that is still studied, discussed, and analyzed with immense care and necessary circumspection in China. The silence that fell over the country in 1976 was not just the end of a political movement, but the beginning of a profound, cautious reevaluation of the relationship between power, ideology, and the direction of the state. Now, as we conclude this quiet chronicle, let the weight of these immense, complex historical events settle softly. The words are finished, the pages of history are closed, the lessons remain.